like that. It's very interesting because the two books that I'm teaching, this book and the book about Revolutionary War, Revolutionary Love, kind of hit on war at the same time. Because reality is that we as Christians in our history have often chosen war, right? Defend our belief system, defend our country, all of those kinds of things. And yet Christianity at its core, Christ's teachings at their core, are pretty strongly against that, right?
Yeah.
And in the United States, though, that statistic he gave right at the beginning of the chapter, we account for almost half of the world's military spending, and our armed forces are as powerful as those of the next dozen countries combined.
Yeah.
Who are we afraid of that we have to build up so much stuff? And how can we do all of that and still call ourselves Christian? Which is what some people are trying to do. And some of those people are very strongly on the defense side of things. How do we get? Go ahead.
It may not even be who we're afraid of. It's pretty much a bully stance. We're more armed than you are, so you better do what we say.
Yeah.
So it could be, I mean, it's partially either one or both. I don't know, but.
And is it any wonder then, Judy, that over the last little bit, we've seen quite a bit of bullying behavior from people like a president, from senators, from high elected officials that in part our defense policy, I think, has given permission for.
It's reciprocal.
It's reciprocal. Yeah. So the question is this, I think, how do we change that?
Right.
How do we sit in a country where there's so much money spent on military when there's so many other areas that with just a sliver of that budget could be helped immensely? Essentially, how do we help we as a nation to put down our guns so that we can help each other?
Some days I feel the only hope is to teach the babies better, but that takes such a long time to filter down.
Yeah. So let's talk about the little history lesson that he gave us and see how we got here. You know, we started off by essentially nonviolence. We started off as Christians saying we will not do any of that. Now, I want to note that that's probably the time of greatest growth, percentage-wise, in the history of of the Christian movement, right? In those first 300 years, we grew tremendously during that amount of time, and partially it was because we were taking a very nonviolent stance. We became legitimized by Constantine, became the religion of the land, and suddenly we had to ask different questions. And Augustine asked one of those types of questions: just war theology. When is it not even our right, but more our responsibility to go and do something? So, for example, those of you who remember World War II at all, that was a space where, as a world, we felt like we had to go in and stop the injustice that was being done. Okay? And we felt like we had to, as people of belief, step into that space of making war. But then we got into the third phase, which he called the Holy War theology. And Holy War was, we're right, so we have to impose. We're right, we have to stop. We have to change. We have to put our stuff on top of, because we're the holy ones. But then I was intrigued by the fourth step, which he didn't have in his first three. But then he said afterwards that we get into this space where we just have a conventional acceptance of war, and we support war when our group, our nation goes to war. And how much of that do we see right now? Well, of course it's right, because America is going to war, and America is good and godly and wonderful. And so of course we just support that. So it's not about being holy. It's not about being just. It's about the fact that our country makes a decision. And so we go. So as you go through all that history, what do you think? And where in that spectrum do you think you lie?
Well, I was intrigued by what he said late. I think it was later on after that, like, what would have happened if the German people had said in the early 1930s, this is wrong? I mean, at the point where Hitler was overrunning all of the other countries, perhaps there wasn't any other way to stop him other than war. But earlier on, there might have been a way to stop him. And I thought, you have to have enough people who were willing to do some sort of sacrifice to make that happen. And I'm not sure how we get into that form now, although I think a number of people made a sacrifice over the last year to make sure that our election turned out the way it did. I mean, people took their time to work on the election. People sacrificed their political careers to make a change. So I think that was one thing, but as far as the overarching thing, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one. And I think sometimes war is the easiest thing to do. Think about the playground. Somebody steps on your toe, the first thing that happens is your fists clench very easily, isn't it? And you automatically want to push back. What gets it so that we take a different position than that? I think we have to be very actively choosing differently. Because if we just go to with our first instinct, we will always fight back. Right? But then we go beyond that. I like the point that he made at the end of the chapter where he said that defense is often not about defense. Right? The Department of Defense. We have to go on the offense. We have to go and we become the attacker, the aggressor, rather than just defending ourselves. And when you make that turn, it's hard to go back. And I think we've made that turn as a nation.
From what Doris said about back in Hitler's time, he would call the press the false press. I can't remember the German word for it, but it was just when, Trump and calling the press evil. And I thought, this is just a replay of the 40s or the 30s, It was, okay, so then instead of going along with it, what if the people had said no? But they weren't. It was a strong personality they were trying to follow. And these Proud Boys seemed to want a hero to follow, and Trump was it. So, instead of following our cries for peace, they follow the one that heads to power.
Yeah.
And it was so good that the election turned out this way, but still so scary because of the press on the far right that, well, like in Montana, where my daughter lives, that's all they hear.
Yeah.
And she has to say one voice against that.
Yeah. And it is still very scary, especially in spaces like that. We have the wonderful privilege at St. Francis to be in a space where we get to hear a different voice on a regular basis from each other. We get to people like your daughter. You're exactly right. She is hearing one set of ways to view all of this, and it is difficult for her.
Mhm. Well, she's hearing both sides because she chooses to.
Because she chooses.
But the people she lives with only choose the far right news.
Yeah.
And they're getting a different view.
Yeah. And there's a lot of the people that I bring up, that's the truth about them.
Yeah.
As I talk about people like my cousin Bob,
Mhm.
that's all he listens to.
Yeah.
How have we as churches made it so that's the truth? Why is it that we have fallen into the defense mechanism rather than the challenge of? And what do we do about it is the next question. Because many of my convictions are absolutely in alignment with what he's writing in here. Christians are called to peace and nonviolence. I think that's absolutely where we should be. But getting us to that place is the challenge.
I think I see a lot of parallels with this whole thing about national defense with the movement for restorative justice. And I think that, restorative justice is proven to work. It makes offenders less violent. It gives healing to those who are injured. But it just takes a lot of time. And I think that that's one of the things, we just want to pick up our fists and smack the person who did something bad to us. We don't want to sit down and listen. And it's a commitment to time that I think is one of the big factors in this.
There's a TV show that Joni and I watch called All Rise. Does anybody watch that?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
One of the lawyers there is trying to do restorative justice, and he is finding all the roadblocks to it, all the difficulties of it. None of us are very well schooled in how to do that, and so when somebody tries to say, "Let's talk about it," we have to overcome a whole lot of stuff to want to step into that room, into that space of communication. And it is much more difficult. But my belief is that if we would make that effort, we could transform ourselves. Why don't we make the effort? And how do we push so that effort is made? Here's what I learned as a first grade teacher. Punishment is easy. It doesn't change behavior.
Yeah.
Never changes behavior by itself. It stops behavior, which you sometimes have to do, but it doesn't change behavior. To do that, you've got to work in a different realm, use different tools than just punishment. And we've made a huge commitment in America to just punish. Throw people into prison, Our prisons are filled with people that we're punishing. And have we made a better world because of that?
I think one of the things that we have to do is find ways to talk with the people who are other to us. Scott and I were talking about this. I think it was earlier in this book when he talks about the us versus them. And I started thinking, we have all kinds of us's. We have the us's of the neighbors on our block, several of whom we know.
Uh-huh.
One of whom is still flying a Trump flag.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
how do we, and we've both talked to her lately. Neither of us asked her when she was going to take her Trump flag down, but it's slowly being battered by the weather. So maybe it'll just fall apart. But,
Mhm.
you know, finding the opportunities to speak about the issues with people who are our others. It's hard sometimes because we tend to surround ourselves with people who are more like ourselves.
Right.
And if we're surrounding ourselves with family or neighbors who are other, we don't talk about the otherness. We only talk about the things we have in common. So it's hard.
And that is one of the key issues. And kind of goes I was thinking about that as I was reading the next chapter about God and love and all of that, you know, minor stuff, right? How do I look at that other person, that person who, from my perspective, feels so wrong? And instead of taking a place of, well, God loves me and that's enough, look and say, God loves that person too, and truly extend my heart towards them. Because it's that type of view that ultimately I think is going to heal many of these questions that we're struggling with. If I can truly see the other person as a beloved, as part of my own self, even, can I as easily make war? Instead, what we do very often is we limit God's love, don't we? We talked about, he used the word the elect. God loves the elect, the children of Israel. In our situation, it would be very simple to say, well, God doesn't love anybody who walked into the Capitol building and raided that sacred spot. And yet the reality is guess what? Our best selves know that those people are as loved as what we are. So I can't just make war on them. I have to deal with the fact that they are part of this family of God. But one of the reasons why they can make war on me is because they're dealing with the same thing. They can look at me and see me as not one of the selected ones, as one of the people that's fighting against what God wants. So how do we get in a conversation? If my conviction is truly that God doesn't want war, if that's a strong conviction for me, that God wants us to be peace-like people, then there's things that I need to be involved in, because our policies as a state, as a nation especially, have to do with an endorsement of war, right? Have I shown you the statistics about defense spending in America? Look at this graph. Let me show you this. Down here at the end, this is 1900. Can you guess what this little spike is right here?
World War I.
World War I. This enormous spike is
World War II.
World War II, where we became one of the preeminent world powers. And so guess what happened at the end? Instead of going back to pre-war times like in World War I, look where we stayed. Because at this point, and going through the 50s, we had to fight against that communist threat, that enemy that we saw. And look how we've continually gone as a general up and up. Right here, guess what this is?
9/11.
9/11, and suddenly we allowed ourselves to spend a whole lot more for a long time. This is the Obama era where a cutback was made in defense spending, which of course here at the very end you can see this is where Trump is beginning to change that, or wanting to change that. But look at how high even Obama's level of spending on war was way up high, almost like we're in the most active war we've had in the last century. Do we need to be at that level of defense spending? Or have we just let something go amok? And here's the thing about all that spending. It's not just that we're spending more on war, it's that we're spending less on name the items.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've chosen to not give love to each other by improving our roads, by building our infrastructure, by taking shortcuts, for example, in Texas, with the way they regulate their utilities, that have short-term benefits, but that sooner or later you have to pay the price of. Why are we so invested in what I would consider a fear-based space?
So maybe we need to redefine the Defense Department as defense against disease, defense against poverty, or so many other ways that that money needs to be allocated. Trump wanted to change some of that and put it into the wall, but maybe we could change it and put it into healthcare and education.
And the really hard part about that, Judy, because I agree with everything that you say, and getting from here to there.
Yep, I know.
Especially getting from here to there non-violently, right? How do we hold on to our best selves and continue to be our best selves as we do that? And because I don't think most of you in this room are going to pick up a gun and force someone to believe like you do. I don't think, right? But how
I tried to shoot myself in the foot.
but I'm certain that at least part of the rhetoric from the right is where they feel like you're being violent towards them, and I know you're not, but they feel like you're forcing them to. And how do we move that way without leaving them feeling like they've been violated in some way or another? Because that's part of the rhetoric that's out there right now, isn't it? And how do we overcome that?
I'm hoping that this administration with it's educated, it knows how to handle problems, and it doesn't speak like in the Trump era of putting people down all the time, like the Rush Limbaugh type of person, always putting people down. And you hear that over and over. And some people think, okay, I have to act that way, but you don't. And so maybe with this more educated and more, I don't know, presidential or a leader, maybe it's better. And we can follow that.
Yeah.
You know, I think it would help to have a new definition of patriotism and serving your country and that. So, you know, we have relatives in South Dakota, and I remember being there, it must have been close to 20 years ago. And one of Scott's cousins' oldest son had just graduated from high school, and they were so proud that he had signed up to be in the Marines. And I'm like, he's barely 18, and you're so proud that he was going to go serve his country.
Yeah.
And part of that is there's not a whole lot to do in Redfield, South Dakota for jobs. So the military is a really good option for a lot of people in the central part of our country. But if we had a different kind of service, a WPA kind of service, something like that, where serving your country meant improving the roads or
Right.
fixing bridges, and that might help turn the tide of what patriotism has come to mean in this country.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, hard to get there, but
It's a good idea.
And one of the problems with military, as we've defined it in America, because there's a whole lot of countries around the world that have mandatory military service as
Mhm.
part of their makeup as a country. Peru is that way, for example. But it's not necessarily, let me only show you how to shoot a gun so that you can fight off the enemy. Although that might be part of the training. But much of it is being in spaces where you are not doing what you want. You're serving the greater good. And I think that's part of why people go into the military, but we turn it into, in my mind, way too much of it just, who's the enemy? Let's go back, let's go fight them. So I agree, Doris. How do we allow people to serve without it being a continuation of the story of us versus them in some way or another? Because there's sure a lot of things that could be fixed around the nation. The good news is we do have a few programs like that in place. I have a friend of mine who lives up in Minnesota, but I met her down in Yuma. Her name is Katie Tharp. And she was there because of Teach America, right? Which is saying, we'll forgive some of your student loans if you teach in one of these areas. And so that's a wonderful way to also have public service happen. But Peace Corps, which used to be a huge alternative to, seems to be very small today. There doesn't seem to be much of that. How do we reinvigorate that type of space and say, this is a valid way to serve your country, serve your world? And can we expect more programs like that instead of another bomber?
Yeah.
Now, you know, one of the problems with the bombers is that we have Raytheon, and Raytheon makes a lot of money for Tucson. Not just for the owners of the company, but for our community. We have Davis-Monthan, which supplies an amazing amount of push in our economy here in Tucson. There's a movie, in fact, I have a copy of it here. Like, do you know this movie, Why We Fight?
Mm-mm.
You should watch this movie. It's an interesting movie. And one of the points that they make in that movie, it starts from the talk by Eisenhower as he was retiring, that essentially said, watch out for the military industrial complex. And so one of their big points in there is that over the last half a century, very pointedly, we have placed military installations into every single congressional district. So everybody, all of us, including a pretty liberal Tucson, depend on a piece of our military industrial complex for their economy. And how do we reverse that and essentially do the action that Isaiah talked about of turning our swords into plowshares? How do we help Raytheon to say there's something else that they can spend money on rather than? Because military is a pretty good moneymaker. But aren't there other industries that could do that? If we began building high-speed railways, that could fund a whole lot of company. But something like Raytheon would have to retool.
The thing I've been struggling with as we talked, or as I've been listening, is the tension between not being militaristic and at any level, personal up to international, versus how do you stand up against things that you feel are evils in the world.
Yeah.
You know, and at the biggest level right now, there's like, what do we do about Afghanistan and what kinds of things the Taliban does and stands for? What we do about Iran's move to have nuclear weapons? What do we do about the current actions in Myanmar, where supposedly the rights of the people are being overtaken by military forces, and carry that down all levels to, you know, what do we do about how gay people are treated in our country? And it's not an easy thing to say that we just need to focus our efforts on non-military types of activity.
Yeah, and we can't just all of a sudden put down all the arms and move into the next future. You have to figure out how to phase towards it. But part of the reason why we need guns today is, like Doris said, because we didn't stop Hitler in 1930, and so we had to fight World War II. Right? What is it today that we need to do that will avoid a war 10 years, 20 years, 40 years from now? And that takes a lot more foresight than just, oh my God, they're attacking, pick up your gun and let's go. Right? So we have to be, go ahead.
So one area there, I was just reading through the report that came out from Humane Borders and Derechos Humanos about how Border Patrol search and rescue efforts are not effective, and basically overall their work is destructive, not really doing much to cut back or alleviate deaths in the desert. And their conclusion is, doing away with border restrictions and border patrol. And I was thinking, the root of a lot of the problem has to do with the thing that are driving people to come to this country. And I was thinking, well, how would you have something like what they're calling for? It would be something like the European Union for the Western Hemisphere, and thinking, well, what are the obstacles that would keep us from having that, and thinking about, how do we deal with the actions of the cartels? How do we deal with the gangs and the corruptions in the Central American countries? So it seems like, in terms of what we need to do now, leads more to looking at how can we help create that kind of a relationship and things where we could envision the countries of this continent working together in the way that the European countries are doing it now.
Sure. The difficulty about that, of course, Scott, is that we have enjoyed saying we're the only country that really matters. Well, maybe Canada a little bit,
Mhm.
right? But nothing south of the border, right? Because that's been pretty much our attitude through most of our history, hasn't it?
Mhm.
Let's not consider all those backward countries that are not us.
Or let's consider them for what we can gain from them with the sugar plantations or whatever that the big corporations can do down there.
Or like in Guatemala, the reason there's so many Guatemalan refugees is because we've essentially turned that into a foreign military outpost.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're right that we've exploited, and at least part of all this is the result of our behaviors. But it's much easier to look at the folks at the border and say invaders and put the onus on them, rather than go further back and solve the issues. Because when you go back to the issues, it points the finger back at us. How did we destabilize Central America? So that right now, there's the issues that are there. You mentioned gangs. We exported those gang members to those countries. And it's really easy for us to just say it's them being bad, but they learned much of what they learned in the 1990s of the United States of America and the violence that was happening during that decade.
Which fits in with the scripture that's coming up for Sunday from Thomas. Seek and ye shall find an answer, and then look further, because that's not the end.
Because it's not the end.
We just look at what's happening now and don't explore what started it all. And we're learning, I've just been really impressed, I think, by how much Black American history has been brought to the forefront this particular February from all kinds of avenues.
Mhm.
Streams on Facebook and all kinds of places, the books that are being published, that are revealing those things that I did not know about. And I guess didn't know about because I didn't care to explore. I didn't want to look any further than the answers that I'd been given.
Yeah. It isn't quite just your fault. Most of it is, but not quite just your fault.
I'm not taking the guilt for all of it, but it is, it's not quite humiliating, but it's certainly humbling
It is humbling.
really to realize at this age there is so much that I didn't know
Sure. But
about
lot
so
of that-
many.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that was it. Just that there's, if I don't know that much about Black history in my own country, what is it that I don't know about Central America? What is it that I don't know about Africa and the Far East?
Yeah. And it's because when we have to educate each other, whether it's in the educational system or in general, it's really easy to have, I mean, you have to choose what to say and what not to say. And so in America, for example, on Black-white issues, we have chosen to highlight white America. We have chosen not to say, look at these amazing Black Americans, with a few minor exceptions like George Washington Carver. We've chosen not to notice Black America for their achievements and for their contributions to us. We've chosen that. And so it's not just your fault, it's our fault. It's part of what our system has chosen as a whole. And so the books that get written that teachers teach out of don't have those other stories in them. So you're right that you could learn more, but part of it is a very deliberate action to not allow that to be true. When it comes to gay rights, like Scott mentioned, much of that is how we began talking in America back in the 1930s about gay people. It was a very deliberate effort to change the way we viewed Bible and vilify in a way that we hadn't done before that. We as a nation chose that. None of us, because most of us were not even alive in the 30s, let alone at a position where we could influence the whole country. But decisions were made back then that we're still dealing with today. But if the decisions can be made in the contrary to what we want, the contrary to the vision, we can make decisions now that 70 years from now could make this a whole different country. Right?
You know, one of the things I've discovered that's really helped me see into other parts of society that I didn't know much about is the library. I guess it's the National Library Association puts out a list called Read Harder Challenge every year. And it's a list of 24 books. So you're supposed to read one in each of these types of books. And they're like a book written by someone with a disability that doesn't focus on the disability. A historical fiction written by a person of color. A non-European novel in translation. I just finished that one. It was written by an Omani woman about life in a village in Oman. And I did not know anything about Oman except approximately where it was on the map. So it's been really interesting. I've been doing it for about 3 or 4 years. And just as far as opening parts of life that I had no clue about before. So you can look for it on the Pima County Library website if you want.
And what you really, go ahead.
Sorry, would you repeat what it's called, Doris?
It's called Read Harder Challenge.
Thanks.
So what you've really done, Doris, is you helped us switch over to the last chapter of the book, which I think is his conclusion will solve all the other chapters in his strongest conviction. And that is, do I choose in this moment to love better, to work out of that space of love, or do I allow all these other things to influence me more? You know, when you read a book about, like you talked about with the Omani book, that's choosing to see something larger than what's easy for you. You don't need to do that. You could live your whole life without doing that. In fact, millions of Americans do. But as soon as you do that, suddenly it changes your heart as you look at the world.
Mm-hmm.
right? If we truly believe God is love, which is what is a central tenet of Christianity, right?
Mhm.
And I mean not just one part of Christianity, but as a whole, we believe God is love. From your most conservative to your most liberal, that's a pretty genuinely held tenet. How do we help people live into what that means? How do we have conversations around love that allows some of these things where we're apart from each other to begin to go away? Won't solve all the issues at first, because there's a whole lot of God loves me and not you. God loves you if you, right? But if we can somehow have those conversations, that's at least a space where we start on common ground, isn't it?
Mhm.
And then we start having the conversations like he talked about. What does compassion mean? How do I suffer with somebody that is not me? How do we talk about freedom, and where is it that freedom is not present for somebody? How do we talk about fear? How do we talk about gratitude for what's been given to us? All of those conversations, I think, are conversations that, at least in the starting point, won't put us at odds with each other. Now, as we get into the meat of it, it will, won't it? We'll run up against things that will be difficult for us. But at least we've got some very strong ground that we can start on, right? I mean, none of those things that he mentioned, compassion, freedom, gratitude, none of those are small in the Christian makeup of the world, right?
But I think where you start is right in your relationships. Maybe even just going into the supermarket and you see the person that is checking you out is just not having a good day.
Yeah.
And you try to be compassionate there with saying a good word, or just seeing them as a real person and knowing that maybe your interaction could be a bright spot in their day. And I think
Yeah.
we each have hundreds of opportunities a day to do these things. It's
Yeah.
got to start with us, I think.
And with the expectation that all of us need to be that to each other, and that's not something you can legislate, but it's something that we can begin to expect in our conversations, where it's so easy to become against each other. How do we begin to expect that respect in those conversations? From the highest levels down, right? Is it just about getting my political party's stuff passed, or are we truly in those conversations talking about how we build a better society? Do we not just throw each other into political camps, which causes an automatic us and them?
Well, I'm always reminded too that Andrew Solomon recommends that every young person spend time overseas.
Mm.
And he doesn't even prescribe what culture. He seems to think that anytime you're away from America, you come back changed.
Sure. Because
and you have a different perspective overall just by having been out of this space.
right, and by hearing a larger story, not even one that you have to accept, but a larger story than what America speaks on a regular basis. Right? Just to be able to see that the narrative is bigger than that.
Your trips to Peru, the kids come back and they say, I'm changed. I absolutely didn't know what was going on. Thanks for opening my eyes. And I think that's what we need all the time, is to have our consciousness raised through books, through travel, through just visiting with people. You know, we can do it.
So how do we become that for the person who is stuck in the hollers of West Virginia, right? Or in the hallowed halls of conservative America, Mesa, right? Or, you know what I'm saying? Those spaces where they already have all these ideas fixed in their mind. How do we sit in those spaces with them? Begin to have these kinds of conversations. It's interesting to look at my Facebook feed, because one thing that comes up quite often is about term limits for Congress, right? Now, here's what's really interesting about it. The people that I have on my Facebook feed who put those up range across the spectrum from far right to far left, right? Term limits is not a partisan issue. And those folks on the far right and the far left could come together and talk about that issue. There's a lot of stuff that they're not going to agree with, but there's people that want term limits for from a lot of different political spaces, because it's not a right-left issue. It's some other part of the spectrum. You know, they're all up on this part of the spectrum, probably libertarian type of a perspective, but that's what we have to find out. Not what divides us, but what is it that is in common between us. And it's really easy to focus on the stuff that's different about us, isn't it? But I'm almost betting that the person who's farthest away from you politically loves their children the same way you love your children. You might disagree about how to discipline or what to do with those children, but I'll bet they love their children. Wouldn't you bet?
Mm-hmm.
And if you start on that type of a space, can you begin to have a conversation? I sure hope so.
One struggle I think we have is putting ourselves into the midst of the place where we hear these things that we disagree with and that bother us. Example for us is that our older daughter has horses, and she does a lot of endurance rides, 50-mile rides and so on. And the group of people that are involved in that, for the most part, are more conservative in their stance. And just being a part of some of the forums that they're in is very disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And sitting, and we've gone to support her in her rides, and sitting with the other people who are supporting people who are riding. You know, it's hard, I think, sometimes to hear the people that are saying what people are saying in that proximity and figuring out how to respond in a constructive way, where we all share, you know, some of the love of the horses and the riding. We have that in common, but our inclination is kind of to pull back from that and not put ourselves in with those people, you know, because of the discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. Don Smith You should talk to him sometime because he's been in that same type of situation. Most of the time during the summer, he goes and rides horses, different places, right? That's
Who is that?
Don Smith.
I know who he is.
Yeah, he's one of our members, usually goes to 745. Amazing man. And same type of a space. And he's pretty clear about how he's had to sometimes draw lines and whatnot. The hard part is that singular answers will often get us into those spaces where we don't talk to each other, where we say, you have to absolutely believe this or else. And I got to tell you that we can do that as well. How many know that, for example, on LGBT rights, it is just stupid for anyone not to support that group. But if we voice that in such a way that says, you're stupid if you don't, you're hateful if you don't, if that's somewhere where we draw a line, where we refuse relationships, do you see what we're doing if we're not careful? Because I think we're right on that issue, but we can use it in a way that eliminates conversation and relationship.
A lot of time, those opinions are based on fear.
A lot of
And we
times.
have stories that tell a different story.
Yeah,
In a non-threatening way, just tell your story.
yeah.
Um,
And it was freedom from fear that he specifically was talking about, is how do we step away from that fear to have courage? Because the conversations we're going to have are not non-courageous conversations. We're going to have it, and that other person is going to have it. So I want you to think, kind of as we end here, it's time for us to go, but what in your life has given you courage? Where have you found the freedom to be able to speak? What's helped you?
I think this.
So Jim, in the area that you were talking about groups that are supporting LGBT rights, I think one model that has been extremely helpful for me has been PFLAG, and it's Parents, Family, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays was how it was originally named. And the thing that was so helpful about it is that all of the methods was to bring people together, families who talked about the gay members of their families or their gay friends and their journey in acceptance. And people were brought into that group because they were struggling with that. So something that mirrors that kind of model in other ways.
Yeah. Some type of space. It always helps when you can say, oh, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a lot of where we need to provide that type of space. Sandy, you were going to say something.
Oh, I'm just so glad you brought this up because it's my favorite book.
It's a great
I
book,
think
isn't it?
I've got two favorite books, well, a little bit more, but ones that have really made a difference. This one and The Gentle Art of Blessing by Pierre something or other.
Yeah.
They just really give you, they speak to my roots, you know,
Yeah.
and they make me fearless.
Thank you.
And then I never knew when that vampire Christian, that payment Christian started. And
Yeah.
He tells about that.
Yeah.
That's
That gives you
fascinating.
some really good information to be able to be there.
It is.
Nobody, I think, sets out to be a vampire Christian. I don't think, but we do get into roles where we are using each other very easily. Sometimes, one of the reasons why we build enemies, you know why? Is because if they're wrong, it gives strength to my politic to defeat them.
Power.
It is a source of power for us. And can we find that same kind of power without diminishing the other person?
Yeah.
right? That we can if we're in a space of love. Who else? What else has given you strength?
Being at St. Francis has given me the opportunity to practice saying what I think and getting feedback, and somehow just the practice and not being shot down the first time I say it allows me to say it again in a less comfortable situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And take it as it comes. But I need that first try in safe water.
That's right.
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
swim in the ocean before I swam in a pool. I could.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving that space where you get to safely find your voice is important. And so think about that as you move towards some of the people that oppose you on different issues. Is there a space? Are you providing a safe space for them to truly voice what they are, who they are? I told you about my friend Nancy. Did I tell you about her? She was my music leader at a church 20 years ago. And we went on a mission trip to Ecuador. She has a good heart, but she's writing things right now like President Biden really isn't in charge of the nation. It's the military has taken over and he's just a figurehead. Now, I can fight all that because it's so patently wrong, or I can continue to be in a space where maybe she can continue speaking and we can continue to have a conversation. And I don't know what you do with all that wrong that somebody brings into a space, because there's a lot of it that's very harmful. And you have to figure out what you fix now and what you leave till later. Right?
You know, one of the most helpful phrases I learned along the way, as far as, you know, like what Sandy was saying, tell your own story, is the phrase, that's not been my experience. When someone says something, it's a pretty non-confrontational way to start to speak your own truth, because I'm not very good at confronting people. So just to say, that's not my experience.
Yeah.
And then tell your own story has been helpful to me. Because you're not saying somebody's wrong.
Well, we've got to go, or more specifically, I have to go down to the TCC and get my shot. So I'm going to see you later.
Hey,
Yeah.
Okay.
Come in.
All right.
Good luck.
Borrow this movie if you want to. It will be sitting just inside the door to my office. It'll be right there for you if you'd like to borrow it. It's
Thanks, Jim. One thing that gives us a voice is this Hollywood Squares that you're holding for us. Thank you.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, you guys. I appreciate the whole class.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye,
Happy shot.
everyone. Yeah.